let's see how this goes. So hi, those of you who are able to be here in the moment. I see folks from TLS, and I see Jill and Janet. Hi, Jill. Hi, Janet. Everyone else who might watch this later on, I hope it turns useful for you, and I hope that you feel free to get in touch with me if any of it's interesting, or if you want to chat more about any of the ideas I'm going to present here. Thanks, Natalie and the TLS team for having me do this workshop. I think by nature of the fact that there's only a few teaching faculty here, I'll keep it a little more talky than workshopy. And I'll say that at the outset, it can sound like I'm kind of preaching as I go through all these things, like here's the way to do this teaching stuff. And I want to say that I'm certainly not someone who does every single one of the things I'm going to recommend. I do my best to integrate as many as I can into as many classes as I can, but even right now, I'm not really happy with the exams I used last semester in research methods and statistics in psych, so that I'm trying to figure out a way that I can come up with a design that works better for me and for the students with some of the things I'm going to tell you today in mind. So there's a couple of demos in here that I will just kind of give time for folks who are watching later to experience. If you're watching live and you want to put something in, you want to pop in and say something or come into the chat window, I have it open over here. This is why I'm looking at a strange angle on the video. So the first one of these is I challenge you, without collaboration or Google, to try to name Snow White's 7 dwarfs from the Disney film. Can you come up with all 7 of their names? Just give you a minute. If you're having trouble deciding whether one thing you think of is a name or not, you could alternatively just work your way through all the names by writing down every name that occurs in the order it pops into your head. I'll just give folks 30 seconds or so to think through this question. You know all the names of the dwarves from Snow White. Don't speak up yet if you've got some in mind. And so I want you to think about, I'm going to cut you off and have you think about whether you think this was particularly easy or potentially difficult. Some folks probably found it quite easy. Maybe they've watched the movie lately. Maybe they haven't seen it in years and found it very difficult. Maybe a number of folks have never seen it at all. Maybe folks who didn't grow up in the US or in an English-speaking country wouldn't have seen it ever at all. A mainly English-speaking country, that is. Could be. And so that's kind of a separate point, but something to think about, of course, when we design our courses and our testing methods. But it's also possible that you might be sitting there saying, well, I know what Snow White is, and I could tell you the story, but I don't have that detail in my head right now. Why would you ask such a specific question? So you're starting to have the experience some students think they're having when they're taking exams. Maybe you have a name on the tip of your tongue. You kind of remember one, can't come up with it. This is actually a phenomenon that people study in psychology. We call it the tip of the tongue phenomenon. We see usually that people can describe the word at the tip of their tongue. They can usually tell us how many syllables it has, sometimes even the letter it starts with or what it means without still being able to come up with the word itself. And in this case, the odds are that the word that might be on the tip of your tongue fits with the others in the list. It's maybe 2-ish syllables, maybe 1. It's a vivid adjective. A lot of these start with S's or D's, so maybe that's going on as well. Now, as you look through your list, see if you can find a pattern in the way you recalled the names. Maybe a pattern in sound or in letter. Maybe similar meanings are strung together. Maybe if you've got some names you already kind of know are wrong, they're like the right ones in certain ways. You have a lot of blankies, right? Blanky, 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 and blue or something like that. I think I'm thinking of Pac-Man instead of Snow White, but the same idea is true there, where we're talking about patterns in the way we recall information. So you might have runs of similar names, those blankies all in a row. Now I've got a second task for you before I reveal what's going on here and why I'm doing all this. This is more like a multiple choice test. So here's a list of names. The actual names are contained within this list. Again, without chatting about it with anyone else or looking it up, can you find the 7 names in the list? I'll give you a second to think about that. Few seconds. So in psychology, we call this a recognition task, where the first was a recall task. Define those and talk about those differences in just a second. But basically, this is what we're doing when we're putting multiple choice questions on tests. The previous was what we're doing when we're putting short answer or essay questions on in-class exams. Now, in this recognition test, you probably got more right. Yes, you probably identified a couple in the list that you thought were probably names, and now you're sure that they're names. Okay, we'll talk about why here in just a second. But first, I want to tell you what my goals are with the next, say, 40-ish minutes. I want to talk about some of the known features of long-term memory that are relevant to overall course design and talk about how we might integrate them and use them in our courses. And we'll talk about short-term memory and, in addition to that, attention as important day-to-day classroom considerations. Some bits of this builds a little bit on a talk I gave at Faculty Development Day back in the spring. There I talked about ideas for how to encourage students to study better and design assignments to get students to use those better study tactics, short of just giving them the ideas. And so I'm thinking a little more big picture today about how we can put together entire courses that take advantage of what we know about memory and entire courses that have day-to-day experiences that keep students able to learn and able to absorb new information. Let's start with some basic terms from the memory literature and psychology. The first that I've already mentioned is recall. This is any instance where we ask you to remember something without any kind of clues or cues. And a cue in this instance is anything that aids memory, usually a similar item or an item that's somehow linked to the item that you're trying to remember. So recall, again, is the process of trying to remember something without any of those cues. And then by contrast, recognition is knowing that you've seen an item before, recognizing it in the way we need recognition in day-to-day life. It's a little easier than recall because all you have to do is, again, recognize the item, know that you've seen it rather than pulling it out of your own mind and retrieving it yourself. There's an act of retrieval, an act of memory absolutely happening in both cases, but the recognition task is always just a bit easier because it is a cue. The presence of the correct answer is a cue for your memory. I've also already started saying encoding, storage, and retrieval. In memory research, we tend to think of memory as separated into these 3 pieces. So there is the first encoding stage during which you're trying to think of it like memorize something when you're trying to put something in your memory. Once it's in there, it then sits for some period of time, and that's what we call storage. But then eventually you want to remember it, to bring it back up into your conscious mind, and that process is what we call retrieval. So it has a lot to do with consciousness. When something is consciously going on in our minds, we are perhaps in the process of either thinking about it or maybe encoding it. And then as soon as it leaves our conscious minds, when we're not actively thinking about it anymore, it's being stored. And when we want to bring it back into consciousness, we want to retrieve it. So let's go back to Snow White. Think about which led to you remembering more names. You can answer A or B for yourself. For most folks, the answer is B. Pop an A or B into the chat window in Teams if you so desire. But I'll say a couple of things about this while folks are considering whether they want to get in the chat window. First of all, these names were likely, unless you've seen it recently, stored deep in your long-term memory if you remember them at all. They're now sitting in short-term memory, so you might have easier access to them for a little while. I know that when I started doing this demo, I never remembered Bashful. And now that I've done it a bunch of times, Bashful comes to mind much more easily for me. But what I want you to think about here is whether you feel like you knew these names. So let me show you what they are. Here's the final reveal. These are the actual 7 dwarves' names in the Snow White movie, in the cartoon. But again, I want to know, or I want you to think about whether you knew them. And now that you see them, can you look at them and go, oh yeah, I know all those names. I can maybe even picture or hear someone saying the names, or I can picture what that character looks like. I can picture how he's drawn. So if you couldn't recall them, but you could recognize the names, did you know them? Or even if you couldn't recognize them in that longer list, but you see them all here and you go, yeah, okay, I knew that. Do you know them? Am I trying to get you to remember their names in a way that is so unnatural that it isn't surprising that people might not be able to come up with them? What if I had put the drawings in front of you? Would that have helped? Would that have been a better test of whether you knew the things or not? Or should you just watch the movie? What if you watched the movie on mute and you looked at their behavior and their emotions? Would that have helped you in a way that is more realistic? So what I'm getting at is which type of memory really matters here? And this is the question I think we should be asking when we develop assignments and tests. What do students need to be able to actually do? Either in our classroom, if that's the container we want to think about, or after in future classes or in their future job. How are they going to use the information we're asking them to integrate into their minds? And what are the conditions going to be around the retrieval of that information? So let's get into it. I'll talk about some concepts first, and then I'll finish with applications. Something that becomes clear the more and more you study psychology is that we love to draw lines. Psychologists in particular like to say, okay, this is that, and over here on the other side is this other thing. And one of the lines we draw in memory is that between short-term and long-term memory, primarily because they happen in different places in the brain, somewhat, though there is a lot of shared activity, and because they tend to have very different looking processes as far as we can tell for how they work on the inside. This is arguable. There are some folks who would disagree with that contention, but for those folks who do draw the line, that's the reason they draw it. So short-term memory then is defined as anything you just saw and you'll need again in a moment. So if you are what students consider to be a dinosaur like me, you maybe remember getting out a phone book and looking up a number and then repeating the number to yourself as you walk over to the phone to dial it. Okay, no one does that anymore. How about you go to a party and there's someone there you've met before and you are with your significant other who knows their name and you can't think of their name. You lean over and go, who's that again? And they say, oh, that's Natalie. And you go over there and as you're walking over, you say, Natalie. And then you get there, you go, hello, Natalie. And it looks like you remembered their name all along. But in fact, it was just sitting in your short-term memory, thanks to the reminder from your significant other in this example. Anytime you're repeating something to yourself for a few seconds until you need it, until you use it, you're using that short-term memory. Short-term memory is also defined in that it is short-lasting, and it actually turns out to have a content limit as well. We can't put a ton of things in it. I'll talk more about that in just a second, because I first want to contrast it with long-term memory, which is anything you stopped thinking actively about and then had to remember later. So anything that is stored for later retrieval. We don't know about the limits of long-term memory. It might be limitless. We might actually all truly live in Bradley Cooper's amazing world where numbers fly around you and you go meet Robert De Niro. But there might be a limit to long-term memory that we haven't found yet. But the strength of it, the power of it potentially is the thing that I want us to learn to take advantage of. So we'll talk a little bit about short-term memory at first, and then we'll move into long-term toward the sort of back half of the rest of what I have here. So short-term memory is actually called working memory by most psychologists working in memory these days. What a terrible sentence that is. Apologies. But the reason for this is that so much happens in working memory, so much is active and going on, that researchers wanted to give it a more active verb that actually describes what it's doing. And it's working. It's working on our memories. It's working with our memories at all times. So I'll call it working memory from here on out. You could exchange that with short-term memory in your head if that helps you keep it straight. Working memory only lasts a few seconds, and it seems like it can contain about 5 to 9 items. There's a little debate on this in the recent parts of the literature. Some newer papers are finding that that 5 to 9 number isn't maybe as accurate as we once thought. In fact, originally we thought it was 7, and then we expanded that to 7 plus or minus 2, which is between 5 and 9. But most people in general have limits in their working memory somewhere around that area. If I ask you to remember a sequence of something, I'll ask you to remember a sequence of digits in just a few minutes here. Most folks remember between 5 and 9 digits. But again, it's short and it's limited. What we know about how working memory works is primarily based on research that's gone into the model developed originally by Baddeley and Hitch in 1974. So their original model is here. Folks have added all kinds of complexities to it since, but I think it's best to initially try to understand through this original version of the model. So you can start at the input on the far left of the slide here. I'll point to it. Am I pointing? I'm not. Here we go. Input over here on the far left. This is the world. This is the environment around you. And so you get input from the environment that hits your senses, your sensory receptors, your eyes, nose, skin, mouth, and ears. And those pieces of our body actually have little bits of memory in them. They have neurons, and those neurons are capable of just a tiny bit of feedback information that can look like a short amount of memory, but that decays, as it shows down here below, very, very quickly. And so if we aren't paying attention to the things that come in through our senses, we aren't really able to use them. They just decay away and disappear. But of the things entering our senses that we do pay attention to, they all make it into this central executive piece. And you can think of that like the sort of homunculus decision maker of the working memory model. It's the thing that's doing all the moving of information back and forth and around. So to picture how this works, I think it's best to work in an example. So you listening right now, I instruct you to imagine your bedroom, your current bedroom, your childhood bedroom, whichever you like. Imagine a bedroom, picture it. Can you pull up a picture of it in your mind? The answer is probably yes, you can. So what you just did when you did that, according to the model, is pulled that image out of long-term memory, unless you're literally sitting in your bedroom and you looked around, in which case you worked from the other side. But if you had to remember it, you pulled it from your long-term memory and you put it on what we call your visuospatial scratch pad, which is the the mechanism that Baddeley and Hitch thought we were using anytime we kind of visually picture something. And maybe you are thinking of some music you used to listen to, or some of the people you used to talk to when you were in your bedroom, especially if you imagined your childhood bedroom, or maybe you're just listening to me talk. That's probably using up your phonological loop. There's a couple other terms in there that we'll ignore for now, but basically that act of repeating the name to yourself, repeating a phone number to yourself as you walk across a room is the use of the phonological loop. So the scratch pad can kind of look at one image at a time. The loop can deal with 5 to 9 items at a time. And the central executive can pass information around all these three different places, the scratch pad, the loop, and long-term memory, all the while it is absorbing information from sensory memory based on attention. For those here in the moment, does anybody have questions about this model of memory before I talk a little more about it? Just for a second. I'll often say to students that it can take up to 30 seconds to formulate a question. Something like 55% of people take more than 30 seconds. And then I'll also inform them that right around 68% of all statistics are made up on the spot, like those three that I just made up. Ha ha ha. Terrible thing to do, especially in a stats class. Pretend I didn't. Let's move on. Seeing no questions. Oh, wait, I think I saw one pop up. All right. Where does, oh, so Natalie, are you thinking if somebody has like a perfect photographic memory, like they,
Yes, correct. Yeah, those who are able to remember longer than the time that you described in the previous slide.
sure. So anytime anything is remembered longer than a few seconds, it is probably sent to and then retrieved from long-term memory is the way we think about it. So if you are actively, consciously thinking about something you've seen, it is in your central executive. And as soon as that piece of thought leaves that experience, leaves that consciousness, it's sent out to long-term memory. So this is the unconscious piece of all this process. Whenever we stop thinking about something and bring it back up, we're using long-term memory. So when people have a photographic memory, they have, or when there's stories too about people having sort of perfect episodic memories from their entire lives. They can remember every moment from their entire history. They have really impressive long-term memories with potentially no limits, but they also are uniquely able to retrieve everything that's in their long-term memory. And that's a question that I don't think we have a good answer to, is when someone has a somewhat perfect memory like that, do they have better long-term memory than the rest of us, or are they just better at retrieving from long-term memory than the rest of us? I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that question, but it's something that, as far as I know, continues to bedevil folks like me. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So I want to focus in on attention just for a second before I keep moving forward. I'm showing you here Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, because a major distinction in the study of attention is between goal-directed factors and stimulus-driven factors. So initially, when looking upon this particular Bosch piece, our eyes are probably drawn to large, obvious objects. I'm thinking probably of the lighter brown big instrument that's kind of in the center of the picture, maybe the guitar slightly to the left, maybe the biggest figure, the sort of blue shirted elephant person, maybe with the pot on there, the cauldron on their head. That might be another salient piece. Those are all examples of stimulus-driven attention. You don't necessarily want to look at those things first, but those grab our attention. But let's say you're looking at this painting in a museum, and your guide says, "Have a look at the small animal playing a musical instrument." Then you now have a goal. So you're going to try to find the animal playing the instrument that they're talking about. I think, which animal am I talking about when I say that? Anybody see the small animal playing an instrument? There's a rabbit up front with some kind of horn. That might be the only one. There's a person on the harp. I think I'm thinking of the rabbit mainly there. Eric likes the avocado cello. Yes, I like that green cello with like the avocado pit as the hole. It's great. So further on, let's say we're still in the museum. Imagine you hear an alarm system ringing in the next room. Well, now there's a whole new stimulus-driven factor that's intervening, and our attention will be drawn away from the picture, and we'll switch to the adjacent room. It's also, by the way, possible to have stared at this image as long as I've been talking about it and still not take it all in. It's possible that I could sort of flip to the next slide. Let's go ahead and do that. There we go. And I could ask you a particular question about something I saw on there that you might not have happened to have looked at. And the point I want to make with this is that attention, as far as we know, has a really sharp, small amount of space visually and auditorily and everything else that we can actually dedicate to it. I tell students that attention is like a laser. It's very focused. It's very narrow. We can really only pay attention to one thing at a time. when researchers try to find instances of truly divided attention, we do, but they're few and far between. And in fact, what happens most of the time when people think we're dividing our attention is that we are actually just switching back and forth between two or more tasks. So the feeling, I always go back to having your phone out while you're driving. The feeling of looking down at your phone and looking up and sort of feeling like you're looking at both and dividing your attention is just a feeling. Most of the time, people are focusing on one or the other and flipping back and forth. And by the way, when you do that, you get worse at both of those things. So the main takeaway from all the task switching research is that as soon as we switch from one task to another, we are a little bit worse at the first task right before we switch, and we're a little bit worse at the second task right after we switch. And so if you're constantly switching, you're constantly bad at both tasks. So you're going to send texts with typos, and you're going to make driving errors, which is potentially much more dangerous. Get off my soapbox. Okay, so back to working memory here as the arbiter, the understander of whatever it is we pay attention to. Working memory is the provider of context mentally for us. It's the thing that gives us the feeling of any kind of effortful processing we're doing. It is also the arbiter of the back and forth between our senses and long-term memory, as we've already discussed. And it turns out that the capacity each person has for working memory might be in individual differences. Some of us might have larger capacities in working memory than others. There's variations by age, there's correlations with other intelligence measures, and a host of other variables, but this is a fairly new area of research. I really feel like I've seen come into deeper consideration since like 2015-ish or so, maybe even more recent than that. So we'll kind of move forward with the idea that working memory typically has a range of about 5 to 9 items in it. And we'll call that the load of working memory, the amount that it can carry. And I'll give you just one example of this from the literature. This example is, I'm just now seeing that it has a typo on it, but this is word length effects, not word length effects. Sorry about that. So a classic finding in the area of working memory actually comes from Baddeley as well back in 1975, and it's that word length affects our ability to remember the word. And so there have been several studies since the 70s that have looked at word length both as a function of the number of syllables in the word equated by meaning or by type of word, but also in how quickly you can read a word. In other words, how many words per second you can read in a given list. Consider a juggler metaphor here. The shorter the items in terms of pronunciation time, the more items you can rehearse before that original trace of that item decays. Same as you've got to keep a number of balls in the air. And so if they are easier to juggle, then you're going to have an easier time keeping them up. But if they're all chainsaws, then you're going to have to focus a little bit more and it might be harder to keep it all going. So here's what the data look like for those kinds of studies. Words with fewer syllables in the graph on the left are recalled better than equivalent words with more syllables. So you see the proportion correct is higher for the lower numbers of syllables on the left upper side of the graph. And on the right side is a reading rate example. So when you plot these same data as a function of how many words per second people can read, there's an almost striking linear relationship between pronunciation time, how fast people can read them, and how many of them they can remember. So again, this originally comes from work done by Baddeley, Thomas, and Buchanan in 1975, but especially the reading rate stuff has been investigated very systematically in all the years since, and it turns out to come out with findings that are just that we don't see stuff this linear very often in psychology. So this is a particularly interesting area for us all. So I'm talking, let me give you an idea of how this feels. I'm going to read some numbers out loud, and I want you to try to memorize the numbers in order as best as you can. 0, 5, 7, 2, 9, 3, 4, 6, 0, 3, 7, 8, 5, 6, 2, 4. And I shut off the captions for a second because I noticed it was tracking me. So just pause for a second. We'll have a little short retention period here. You're probably doing a little rehearsal. Okay, if you have something in front of you, write down as many of those numbers as you can in the correct order. Take a couple seconds to do that. I'm going to ask how many you can remember. When we do this demo live, most folks are sitting right around 7. I think I've found that lately people are better and better at this. A lot more folks are remembering 7, 8, and 9, but there's always people remembering 5 or fewer, and 6, and always plenty of people above 9 as well. So there's quite a range to people's working memory span. But I think we might feel like it's hard to imagine just how small that container might be until we start trying to do it. So we see the short length of your phonological loop there. We have an offer in the chat of B, so somebody remembered 6. So now think about how that might matter in the classroom. Let's move in how all of this might matter in the classroom. So first big takeaway from all this working memory research, attention is a crucial piece of this. If we aren't attending to something specifically, we're not going to remember it. We're not going to pull it into our working memory, and we're certainly not going to be able to send it off to long-term memory. So attention is narrow, and it's also short. So in the classroom, it's probably good if students are pointed at you. So if you teach in a room where the computer isn't at the front and you like to use the computer to teach, maybe get a remote and consider finding a way to be able to stand where they're all pointed at you, or maybe reconfigure the room for your class and make sure, of course, to be polite, put it back when you're done. But point the students at you if you want them to be paying attention to you. Another thing we know about attention is that the span of attention is fairly short for most people, and it's usually a little shorter the younger people are. So you can typically only expect folks to maintain attention about 15 minutes at a time. There's a reason that there are a couple demos inserted into this relatively short presentation. So I recommend stopping, resetting at least that often. I'm not good at it myself. I mean, there are demos in this, but they're not every 15 minutes. So finding a way to stop and reset, give them a minute of a break, give them a minute to catch up with notes or do some kind of activity, some kind of short demo or some kind of short discussion, just to sort of refresh the room as often as you can. Working memory has limits. We can only hold so many things in mind at once. So if your slides are really cluttered, it's going to be hard for students to take in the crucial information. If we've made a bunch of points in a row and students are sort of getting stuck in all the different details, it can be really helpful to make takeaway points abundantly clear. And I know folks feel like sometimes that is spoon feeding information to their students, but really when you've gone through 20 different points and it's important that they take away 3 or 5, it's always a good idea to re-emphasize those 3 or 5 at the end. Make your takeaway points abundantly clear. I'll talk in a minute about the difference between difficulty or ease and simplicity. This one I struggle with a lot, avoid going off on unrelated tangents, because if somebody's not following or they're tuning in and out a little bit and then they hear you mid-tangent, they'll go, wait, what's happening now? And you'll really confuse them. Try to repeat and reword things as often as possible. I try to say important things 3 times in a row slightly differently because, again, attention is short. Working memory has limits. If you say the same thing 3 times, you fill up their phonological loop with just the thing that you're saying. That can help. And another way you can reduce working memory load is to share your notes before class. If you're going to put up PowerPoint slides, share those with students before class. If you have them before class, I don't always. Or if you've got notes you're going to talk from or any of that kind of thing, if you can share that with them, that'll help them follow you. It's not a bad thing for people to be following you carefully and meaningfully. Also, take advantage of the good parts of working memory. Offer relevant context whenever possible. Work to correct misunderstandings quickly so that people don't send wrong stuff to long-term storage, that they only send accurate things off in their encoding processes. And like I said, in short, the answer here is keep things simple. Simple is not the same thing as easy, of course. I don't mean make classes unchallenging, but try to keep these experiences simple and clear, informed, and to the point as possible. This probably isn't a revelation for anybody, but if we have a couple of simpler, low stakes assignments throughout the semester, if you can use those to get students to the same place of knowledge or knowledge display as one big test, maybe that's even better because they'll have deeper learning when it's spaced out and deeper learning when their working memory isn't loaded down by stress. It's possible that you might want to test their ability to handle stress and still produce information. It's reasonable. That's something that some folks want when they teach. But if that's not necessarily what you're testing for, it might be worth thinking about whether loading up working memory or blocking working memory with stress could be keeping students from showing you what they actually know. Back to the beginning, thinking about at what point we could say, yes, I knew the names of the 7 dwarves, or they were in there, and once they were properly prodded, I could produce them. Good alliteration there. This is the point where we link to Faculty Development Day last spring. My kind of big point there was that to remember something is to make aspects of your pattern of brain or mind activity resemble some prior pattern. I don't want to say like, go watch that instead of finishing this. If you're watching it online, go ahead and do that. But if you're here, I'll just sort of talk my way through what this means so that you're not feeling annoyed that I am expecting you to have watched the last episode. So because long-term memory is so powerful and is potentially limitless, I want to talk about how to take advantage of that. And the best way we know is to try to make your current pattern of mental activity resemble or reconstitute some prior pattern. And the main thing I want to say today about that is that if you're in the same room when you're trying to retrieve as you were in when you were encoding, you already have an advantage, right? You have some piece of that prior mental pattern of activity going on because you're back in the place you were. And it doesn't have to be the same physical room. Being in the same state, being in the same mood can even help, especially if the test you're taking provides very few cues. So if you're doing a short answer or an essay test, doing that in the room where you encoded the information is going to lead to slightly better memory than doing that in some other room or in some other building. So some places I've worked in the past have done their final exams like all in the gym in individual desks. And I've always wondered if we could put together a study where we compare grades in those exams to an alternative system where the students take their finals back in their original classroom, because I bet those original classroom people would outperform those performing or working in the gym for a number of reasons, but partially at least due to this idea, which we call transfer appropriate processing, enabling your processes to transfer from one instance, that be the encoding instance, to the retrieval instance. This also comes from work by Alan Baddeley. He's a big feature today. But the big famous study was also right around 1975, where Gooden and Baddeley had scuba divers study words either on dry land or underwater. And you might think that studying a list of words and trying to then retrieve them underwater would be so complicated with scuba apparatus on you that people would perform worse in that scenario no matter what. But in fact, if the study conditions matched the test conditions, people outperformed conditions in which there was a mismatch. So if you studied underwater, first of all, I'm sorry for you, but it would be better to then also be tested underwater rather than coming out onto dry land to do your test. Because of transfer appropriate processing, there is something going on in your mental activity that references all the action around you. In fact, in this case, that you were underwater. And so having that already there helps us remember the thing we recently studied. And I said this goes beyond physical location and into state. There's actually a study from a couple years earlier in which the researchers had people study a list of words either sober or intoxicated and then test sober or intoxicated. And here they measured number of errors. And so you can see based on the far blue bar compared to the one next to it, if you are unlucky enough to have studied a list of words drunk, you will probably make fewer errors on the test if you are also drunk at the test rather than if you take the test sober. I don't usually show this slide to students. It's probably not a point I would take home, but it makes clear the idea that being in the same state that you were in at the time of the study session can be important at tests. So if somebody is really happy to be in class every day, let's imagine that person. And then they get to the final exam of a class and they're really mad for one reason or another, or really stressed, then that might affect their ability to remember because they won't be in the same state, the same mood. So let's utilize these ideas in the classroom. Retrieval, based on this idea, is best when it matches encoding in as many ways as possible. So for one thing, there's the room, there's the physicality and the mood and the state all around us, but also we can design assignments with this idea in mind. And so if we align our tests and our other assessments in our courses with this same method, through this same method of retrieval across them all, we can lead students to be able to perform better on tests at the end of the semester. This is also related to this other phenomenon we call the production effect. If you can get students producing things themselves, then they're going to perform much, much better later on than if they just absorb something. So in class, if students can produce information, if they can go and gather it and present it to each other, they're going to remember it a lot better than if I just told it to them. And that's very closely related to these ideas of trying to practice retrieval, coming up with versions of assignments in which we ask students to quite literally do the thing that we're going to ask them to do later. So basically, I'm talking about using testing as a learning tool. This is coming from findings that Roddy Roediger has published with many colleagues over a couple decades now, the basic finding being that people who test over and over on some memory task consistently outperform people who study over and over on some final test. So basically, if you have 6 sessions and somebody studies 6 times and somebody else takes 6 practice tests, on a 7th test, the practice test person will outperform the study person. And there are some specifics to that process. You can study once and then test 5 times. You don't have to only ever test. You might need some initial absorption period. But that part of the process, that act of practicing testing, does a lot more for us than continuing to study or trying to encode over and over and over. And again, that's related to the production effect. The act of testing yourself is an act of production, but also if a student is making a practice test for themselves and then answering the questions on the practice test, they're doing a lot of production. So there's all kinds of good deep processing going on there. One of Roediger's students is Dr. Pooja Agrawal, who is a great speaker about a lot of these ideas. She suggests don't even call them tests, just call all of this retrieval practice. And I actually have this thought that maybe we could go deeper. Let's work on retrieval practice and think about how we ask them to retrieve. Maybe I can come up with assignments that ask students to retrieve the knowledge I want them to have in the same style that they'll see when they leave college and go to work, or when they go to somebody else's classroom, or even just if I can have them practicing retrieval mid-semester in the same style that I'll ask them to at the end of the semester, then I've achieved a nice kind of alignment that will help them both remember the information, but also help them produce and show me what they actually know. So the questions that I ask myself are things like, how are your students going to be using the information from your class when they get into a job? Can we come up with some kind of creative design for a test that gets them using the information the same way they already do in class? I mentioned research methods and statistics earlier. And in that class, the test is here's a data set, run the appropriate analysis. And for the majority of my students, that will never happen to them again. No one will ask them that question again. But what will absolutely happen to them is they will read some piece of science out in the world and they will have to assess whether it was done with good methodology and statistics. So I'm going to try to redesign my exams around that idea, trying to figure out if I can come up with a way to show them somebody's stats, somebody's methodology, and get them assessing it for good quality. I actually taught a class called this Writing for Psychology back when I worked at Texas A&M San Antonio, and I got an exam, created an exam with colleagues there. Basically, they created it, and I took it on, and we wrote newer and newer versions. But the idea is, rather than give them a multiple choice and short answer exam about all the little factoids held in the APA handbook for writing, we gave them a horrible paragraph, asked them to go through it and edit it and come up with things that should be changed in it. So this was the final exam. They went through this paragraph. They identified all the problems, from typos to mistakes in wording to missing citations and everything in between, and asked them to, number one, propose corrections for every mistake they found, but also to cite the chapter and section from the book we were working through to show us that they knew what kind of error it was, to reference back to the textbook. So the idea here is that people can go out then and find these same kinds of errors, or at least notice them in other writing they're seeing. In their own writing, that would be awesome. That's kind of the goal of the course, because it's like a sophomore level writing course for psychology majors. But also in other people's writing, and when they read psychology articles, and then maybe when they get out into the world and they click on an article somewhere that leads them to a place that actually cites a paper, then they could go read the paper and see what kind of writing it's doing, and then whether it's well written, and then lean on their skills from another course potentially to assess the methods and stats. So getting them to do the thing that you want them to be able to do later is the important takeaway here. It can also be useful to encourage students to engage in what we call metacognition or meta-memory. Metacognition is a word we use in psych for thinking about thinking. So anytime you're kind of watching your own inner monologue, you're engaging in metacognition. But anytime you're trying to figure out how much of something you might remember or where you remember something from, you're engaging in a meta-memory task. And so an assignment like this would be having students create their own study guides for a test that's coming up. And then maybe opening a book or turning it into you for feedback on errors they make or things that are missing. And then the advantage is they'll never ask you for a study guide again because they'll have made their own. There's a teacher named Blake Harvard who has these assignments he calls brain dumps, which I think are quite clever. You close everything down, you open a piece of paper, and the student just writes everything they can think of about a particular topic. And then when everyone's done, they open back up their books and their notes, and they try to make corrections and fill in missing pieces. And then they work with people around them to do more of that. And then it's all presented back up to you to make final corrections and fill in any final missing pieces. So it's this collaborative knowledge generation effort that, again, encourages students to engage in meta-memory. So kind of wrap up this designing assignments chunk. I try to, and try to encourage others to try to design assignments that get students doing what they will be doing in the field, and that represents the jobs they'll have, especially regarding memorization. So here's my sort of hot take on memorization in the classroom. If the job we're imagining a student will have when they graduate from our program will allow them the time to look something up rather than having it memorized in their head, I try to drop exams and questions that require that kind of memorization and just give them time to look those things up, because they'll have them when they get out into the world. And the reason I do this, the reason I think it's okay to do this, is that I can, for one thing, have them practice the skills they'll use in the real world. In the college is the real world. In the world outside of and after college, but also I can ask deeper questions this way. And the memorization that they might need will come naturally with time and experience. I'm sure many folks can relate to my experience in grad school of being in the first couple of years just wowed by the studies that everybody had at their fingertips or at the front of their mind. They could go, oh yeah, that's Shepard and Metzler, 1974. And at first going, how do they have all these things in their heads? These people are remarkable. I'll never be that smart. But actually, after several years of interacting with all these things constantly, they are in your head. That memorization that you need comes naturally with time and experience. Show your students what you value through the tasks you have them do, through the point values you assign to those tasks. Try to mimic the tests you'll give in your assignments through the semester. In learning and behavior, for example, they take a couple of quizzes through the semester that all have the same format, that then the final exam is an expanded version of those when I choose to give a final exam. Encourage metacognition, encourage students to be thinking about how much they remember and then to be honestly doing so. It can be easy to say, oh yeah, I remember that when we actually don't. But it also can be easy to conclude you don't remember something if you're being tested about it in an unsurprising or odd way. In a surprising or odd way. I also recommend trying to level the accessibility playing field. By applying all these ideas that I've said so far, you kind of end up quite naturally with assignments that don't require modifications or extensions for most student accommodations because they're already accounted for in the design of these things. And of course, this doesn't need to be a takedown of multiple choice tests. You can write really good multiple choice questions that engage with students' future use of the course content or ask them deeper things than simple memorization, that ask them to work with the content that you're trying to get them to analyze and use. So this can kind of come off as like down with multiple choice, and that's really not my opinion. I think multiple choice can be done well. When I think about accessibility in particular, I'm kind of thinking about the differences between trying to build up like little prop-ups for every accommodation email you get and how annoying that can be and how frustrating it can be for the student and for the professor because everybody has to remember whatever they built up or whatever they created at the beginning of the semester. But if instead of that, you remove the barriers for people who might bump up against them and everybody else, it's just way easier for us all. It's easier for the students. It's easier for us as their instructors. It can also be worthwhile to consider the modality you're teaching in. Activities and assignments that work in person might not necessarily work online, but online courses have their own advantages. There are activities that do work there. And in fact, if your course is offered online, I would say that has a suggestion in it that students could do the work it trains them for, at least partially online as well. So lean into that. Use the fact that they can do asynchronous work with the whole internet at their fingertips. You can get, again, into the skills and the deeper questions instead of just factual memorization. So I talked about designing assignments. Let's talk about courses before I run out of time. I try to design courses that minimize distraction day to day and that ask and present simple tasks and lessons without being easy. So simple, not easy. Do my best to require students to space out their study episodes, ensuring that they have longer, better retention of all the items that they try to remember. This is something I didn't have time for here that I kind of skipped over, but it turns out that when you have a couple of different categories of something to learn, to recognize, or to understand, we intuitively think we should group them with similar items. But in fact, if we interleave them, it turns out that we have we typically see better memory for that across a number of different situations. That's something I'm happy to talk with anyone about later on. If we can rely on more than a few assignments or tests, some high stakes, some low stakes, we reduce that stress that adds cognitive load and that keeps students from being able to process things in their working memory moment to moment. And a last kind of thing I want to highlight is that if it feels impossible to come up with a method that someone finds rigorous enough, quote unquote rigorous, uh, there's fully different ways to grade students that can kind of release us from those stressors on us. Things like labor-based grading systems or contract grading systems, and that's something that I think about and I'm nervous to fully implement myself. So if you're hearing this and you're into it and you want to get in touch, maybe that's a leap we could take together. It's definitely something that is a way to get to complexity without sacrificing and to find simplicity without being easy. A couple extra resources on here, the effortfuleducator.com. I mentioned Blake Harvard. That's his blog and website. Retrievalpractice.org is Dr. Agarwal's website, and she also has a great YouTube channel with all kinds of other videos on it. So I've gone right up to the end here. I swear that this was only 40 minutes when I did it this morning, but thank you all for being here. If anyone wants to say anything in these last couple minutes, happy to do that. I do have a student who might show up at my door at any second here. So